Before the first light reached the hills, the old farmer was already awake. He did not need an alarm clock because many years of living close to nature had taught his body exactly when a new day began. The little wooden house was silent except for the soft ticking of an old clock hanging on the kitchen wall. He slowly sat up, stretched his tired arms, and smiled as he looked through the small window beside his bed. The sky was still dark blue, but a pale orange line had already appeared far beyond the fields. He quietly put on his worn boots, buttoned his faded brown shirt, and walked into the kitchen. The floor creaked gently beneath every step, a familiar sound that had welcomed him every morning for decades. He filled an old kettle with fresh well water and placed it on the stove. Soon the quiet room was filled with the comforting sound of boiling water. He prepared a simple breakfast consisting of homemade bread, fresh butter, honey collected from his own bees, and a cup of hot black tea. He never hurried while eating because he believed that a peaceful morning created a peaceful day. After finishing breakfast, he opened the front door and stepped outside. Cool morning air touched his face, carrying the smell of wet grass, wild flowers, and freshly turned soil. Tiny drops of dew covered every blade of grass like countless little diamonds sparkling in the growing light. Birds had already begun their morning songs from the nearby trees. And somewhere in the distance a rooster proudly announced the arrival of the new day. The old farmer stood quietly for several moments, simply listening. He believed that silence was never empty because nature always had something to say. After enjoying the fresh air, he walked toward the old red barn where his animals patiently waited for him. The cows greeted him with soft sounds, while the chickens gathered near the wooden fence, expecting breakfast. He carefully filled their feeding containers and checked each animal one by one. He gently patted the oldest cow on the neck and smiled as she calmly looked back at him with trusting eyes. He gathered several fresh eggs from the chicken coop and placed them carefully into a small wooden basket. Nothing on the farm was wasted, and every simple task carried its own quiet importance. As the sun slowly climbed higher into the clear sky, warm golden light spread across the fields, making every leaf and every flower shine brightly. The farmer picked up his old straw hat, placed it on his head, and walked toward his vegetable garden. Tomatoes, carrots, onions, beans, and potatoes grew in neat rows that reflected years of careful work and patient hands. He pulled away small weeds, loosened the soil around young plants, and watered those that needed extra care. Every movement was slow, steady, and thoughtful. He never forced nature to grow faster because he understood that everything had its own season. While working, he noticed colorful butterflies flying between the flowers and a pair of rabbits quietly crossing the far side of the field. He simply watched them for a moment before returning to his work. The morning continued without noise, without hurry, and without worry. For the old farmer, this peaceful beginning was not unusual. It was simply another beautiful day, welcomed with gratitude, hard work, and the comforting rhythm of a life lived close to the land. After finishing his work in the vegetable garden, the old farmer wiped his hands with a clean cloth that he always carried in his pocket and looked across the wide field stretching toward the distant hills. The morning had fully arrived, and the sunlight rested gently on the golden wheat like a warm blanket. A soft breeze moved through the tall stalks, creating slow waves that rolled across the field as if the land itself were quietly breathing. He always enjoyed this time of day because the farm felt completely alive without being loud. Every sound seemed to belong exactly where it was. Bees moved patiently from flower to flower. Swallows circled high above the barn. Somewhere near the small stream, frogs occasionally called to one another, adding their voices to nature's peaceful orchestra. The old farmer picked up his walking stick, not because he truly needed it, but because it had accompanied him on countless walks over many years. The smooth wooden handle had become polished by time and by the touch of his weathered hands. He slowly walked along a narrow dirt path that divided his fields into neat sections. Every few steps he stopped to examine the crops with careful attention. He gently touched the heads of wheat, feeling their weight and checking their color. Years of experience had taught him more than any book ever could. By simply holding a handful of grain, he could often tell how the harvest would be weeks before anyone else noticed the signs. He smiled with quiet satisfaction. This year's crop looked healthy. The recent rain had arrived at exactly the right time, and the warm days that followed had helped everything grow strong. He whispered a few words of thanks, not to anyone in particular, but to the land itself. He believed that gratitude belonged in everyday life just as much as work did. Continuing along the path, he reached a small wooden bridge crossing a narrow stream that flowed gently through the property. The clear water reflected the blue sky like polished glass. Small fish darted beneath the surface while dragonflies hovered gracefully above the water. The old farmer leaned against the wooden railing for several minutes, listening to the steady sound of the current. He remembered standing on this same bridge as a young man many decades earlier, full of dreams and endless energy. Now his hair had turned completely white and deep lines covered his face, yet the peaceful feeling he found beside the stream had never changed. Time had changed him, but it had not changed the simple beauty of the place he loved. After leaving the bridge, he noticed an old apple tree standing proudly near the edge of the meadow. It had grown alongside him for most of his life. Its branches were heavy with green apples that would soon become sweet enough to harvest. He gently rested one hand against the rough bark, almost as if greeting an old friend. Beneath the tree stood a simple wooden bench that he had built many years ago from leftover pieces of oak. He sat down for a short rest and removed his straw hat, letting the breeze cool his forehead. A family of sparrows landed nearby, completely unafraid of his presence. They hopped through the grass searching for seeds while the farmer watched them with quiet amusement. He had learned long ago that patience often brought nature closer. There was no need to chase beautiful moments because they usually arrived on their own. After a few peaceful minutes, he stood up once more, adjusted his hat, and continued his slow walk toward the orchard. The day was still young, many small tasks remained to be done. And he welcomed each one with the calm confidence of someone who understood that a meaningful life was built not through extraordinary events, but through ordinary days lived with care, kindness, and steady hands. The old farmer followed the familiar path toward the orchard, where rows of apple, pear, plum, and cherry trees stood quietly beneath the bright blue sky. By now the sun had climbed high enough to warm the earth, yet the shade beneath the trees remained cool and pleasant. He always enjoyed spending part of his morning in the orchard because it reminded him that good things required patience. A fruit tree could not be hurried. It needed years of careful attention before it offered its sweetest harvest. As he entered the orchard, the fresh scent of leaves and ripening fruit surrounded him. Bees drifted lazily from blossom to blossom on the trees that still carried a few late flowers, while butterflies danced above the long grass growing between the rows. The farmer paused beside each tree, inspecting its branches with experienced eyes. He searched for broken limbs, signs of insects, or fruit that had grown too heavy and needed support. Whenever he found a damaged branch, he carefully trimmed it with a small pair of pruning shears that he kept hanging from his belt. Every cut was gentle and thoughtful. He believed that caring for a tree was much like caring for people. Sometimes removing a small problem early prevented much greater trouble later. He filled a woven basket with a handful of ripe apples and several juicy pears. He did not pick more than he needed because he liked leaving plenty of fruit for the birds, the squirrels, and the occasional deer that visited the orchard in the quiet evenings. Sharing the land with wild animals had never bothered him. In his eyes, the farm belonged to nature first and to people second. Carrying the basket beneath one arm, he continued walking until he reached a small wooden fence surrounding several beehives. The gentle humming of thousands of bees filled the warm air like a soft song. Many people were nervous around bees, but the old farmer respected them deeply. He understood their importance and never approached them with fear or impatience. Standing a comfortable distance away, he watched them leave and return to the hives in an endless rhythm of work. Their tiny wings glittered in the sunlight as they disappeared into the surrounding fields filled with wildflowers. He smiled quietly, knowing that both the flowers and the orchard depended on these small, hard-working creatures. After checking that everything around the hives was clean and secure, he slowly walked back toward the farmhouse. The kitchen windows were open, allowing the fresh breeze to move gently through the house. Inside, he washed the fruit in cool well water and placed it on a simple wooden table. Lunch was never complicated. He sliced a piece of homemade cheese, cut thick slices of fresh bread, added a few tomatoes from the garden, and poured himself another cup of tea. Sitting near the open window, he ate slowly while watching the trees sway outside. There was no television playing, no radio filling the room with noise, and no phone interrupting the peaceful afternoon. Only birdsong, the rustling leaves, and the distant sounds of animals reached his ears. After finishing his meal, he carefully washed every dish by hand and placed them neatly on a drying rack. Then he stepped onto the front porch carrying his favorite old rocking chair a little farther into the shade. He sat down, closed his eyes for a few minutes, and allowed the gentle breeze to cool his face. He did not fall asleep. Instead, he simply rested while listening to the quiet heartbeat of the farm around him. The afternoon still held many small responsibilities, but none of them demanded haste. The fields would wait. The animals would wait. Nature itself seemed to understand that every living creature deserved a peaceful moment beneath the warm midday sun before returning to the simple work that gave each day its quiet purpose. The old farmer remained on the porch for a little while longer, gently rocking back and forth as a pleasant afternoon breeze drifted across the farm. The warmth of the sun had softened, and thin white clouds slowly floated through the wide blue sky. After his short rest, he stood up with the quiet determination that had guided him through countless seasons. There was never a shortage of work on a farm, yet he had learned that every task became lighter when approached with patience instead of hurry. He picked up his old straw hat once again, took a deep breath of the clean country air, and walked toward the weathered wooden fence surrounding the pasture. Some of the fence posts had begun to lean after the heavy spring rains, and he had planned to repair them before autumn arrived. Carrying a small hammer, a handful of nails, and several fresh wooden boards, he carefully inspected each section. Whenever he found a loose plank, he secured it firmly with slow, steady movements. He measured each piece with his eyes rather than a ruler, trusting the experience built over many decades. The sound of the hammer echoed softly across the open fields, blending naturally with the distant singing of birds and the gentle rustling of leaves. It was not the sharp noise of a busy city but the calm rhythm of honest work. While repairing the fence, a curious brown rabbit appeared from the tall grass nearby. It stopped only a few steps away, twitching its nose as it watched the farmer. Instead of chasing it away, the old man smiled warmly and continued working without making any sudden movements. After a few quiet moments, the rabbit calmly disappeared back into the meadow. Encounters like these always reminded him that the farm was shared with many lives beyond his own. Once the fence was finished, he walked toward the small tool shed standing beside the barn. Inside, every tool had its proper place. Rakes hung neatly on one wall. Shovels stood together in one corner. Gardening gloves rested on a wooden shelf beside carefully labeled jars filled with nails, screws, and spare parts collected over many years. The farmer believed that taking care of tools was just as important as using them. Before putting away the hammer, he wiped the dust from its handle and returned it to the hook where it had belonged for decades. A clean workshop, he often thought, made tomorrow's work easier. Leaving the shed, he noticed several young saplings growing near the edge of the property. During the previous winter, a strong wind had damaged some older trees, and in the spring he had planted these new ones to replace them. He carried 2 buckets of water from the well and slowly watered each sapling until the dry soil became dark and moist. Their thin branches swayed gently in the breeze, and although they were still small, he imagined the shade they would provide many years into the future. He knew he might never sit beneath their fully grown branches, but that thought never saddened him. Planting trees had always been an act of hope rather than expectation. He believed that every generation should leave the land a little better than it had found it. As the afternoon slowly moved toward evening, long shadows stretched across the fields, and the bright sunlight turned into a softer golden glow. The air became cooler, carrying the rich scent of warm earth, fresh hay, and distant pine trees. The old farmer paused beside the pasture and watched his cows graze peacefully while a few chickens wandered freely around the yard, scratching the ground in search of insects and seeds. Everything moved at its own gentle pace. There was no rush, no pressure, and no unnecessary noise. Looking across the land that had been his home for so many years, he felt a quiet sense of contentment. The farm did not offer luxury or excitement, but it gave him something he valued far more deeply: purpose, peace, and the comforting knowledge that another ordinary afternoon had been lived with care, gratitude, and respect for the simple rhythm of the natural world. As the afternoon slowly faded into evening, the sunlight became softer and painted the fields with warm shades of gold and amber. Long shadows stretched across the grass, and the air lost the heat of the day, becoming fresh and comfortable once again. The old farmer always loved this part of the day. Morning was full of beginnings, but evening carried a quiet feeling of completion. It was the time when both people and nature seemed to slow down together. He walked steadily toward the barn, carrying a small wooden bucket filled with fresh grain for the chickens. They immediately gathered around his boots, clucking happily as he scattered the grain across the ground with slow, practiced movements. He watched them peck at the earth, smiling at the familiar little arguments that always broke out whenever two hens reached for the same seed. Their tiny disagreements never lasted long, and within moments they were peacefully searching for food again. Nearby, the ducks wandered toward the small pond behind the barn, leaving gentle ripples across the still water as they swam. The old farmer leaned against the fence for a few moments, enjoying the peaceful scene without feeling the need to do anything at all. Sometimes simply watching life unfold was enough. After feeding the chickens, he entered the cool shade of the barn where the cows quietly waited for their evening meal. They recognized the sound of his footsteps and turned their heads toward him with calm, familiar expressions. He filled each feeding trough with fresh hay that had been gathered earlier in the summer and stored carefully in the loft above. The sweet smell of dry grass filled the barn, mixing with the scent of old wood that had absorbed decades of changing seasons. As the cows began eating, he gently brushed the neck of the oldest one with his weathered hand. She had lived on the farm for many years and had become almost like an old friend. He spoke to her in a soft voice, not because she understood every word, but because kindness never required an audience capable of answering. The simple act of speaking gently made the barn feel even more peaceful. Leaving the barn, the farmer carried an empty watering can toward the flower garden beside the house. His late wife had planted most of those flowers many years before, filling the garden with roses, lavender, daisies, and colorful wildflowers gathered from nearby meadows. Although many seasons had passed since then, he continued caring for the garden with the same devotion she once had. Every evening he watered the flowers carefully, making sure the roots received enough moisture before the cooler night arrived. As he worked, the sweet fragrance of lavender drifted through the air, blending with the rich scent of damp soil. Bees had already returned to their hives, but a few butterflies still floated lazily among the blossoms. Unwilling to end the day just yet, the farmer paused beside a blooming rose and admired the delicate petals glowing softly in the evening light. Beauty, he believed, often appeared quietly and asked only for someone willing to notice it. When the watering was finished, he sat on the wooden steps leading to the porch with a small basket of apples he had picked earlier in the day. Using a pocket knife with a polished wooden handle, he slowly peeled one apple while watching the western sky begin to change colors. Orange melted into pink, pink faded into purple, and the first bright star appeared above the distant hills. He ate the apple slowly, enjoying its crisp sweetness, then placed the peel beneath a nearby tree where birds and insects would soon make use of it. Nothing on the farm was truly thrown away. Every fallen leaf, every leftover vegetable, and every piece of fruit eventually returned to the earth that had provided it. This endless cycle had always fascinated him. Nature accepted everything with patience and transformed it into new life without complaint. As darkness gradually settled over the countryside, the evening chorus began. Crickets filled the fields with their steady music, while frogs sang from the stream beyond the pasture. The breeze gently stirred the leaves of the old oak trees surrounding the farmhouse, creating a soft whisper that seemed to carry the memories of countless seasons. The old farmer looked across his land one more time before heading inside. The animals were safe. The garden had been watered. The fences stood strong. The orchard rested beneath the deepening sky. There would always be more work waiting tomorrow, but for now the farm had grown quiet, wrapped in the peaceful stillness that only a calm summer evening could bring. With a grateful heart and tired but satisfied hands, he opened the front door, leaving the gentle sounds of the countryside behind him as another beautiful day slowly moved toward its peaceful end. The old farmer quietly closed the front door behind him and gently removed his straw hat before hanging it on the same wooden hook where it had rested every evening for many years. The little farmhouse felt warm and welcoming after a long day outside, and the familiar smell of polished wood, dried herbs, and fresh bread filled every corner of the kitchen. The last golden rays of sunlight slipped through the windows and stretched across the old wooden floor before slowly disappearing as night settled over the countryside. He carefully placed the basket of apples on the kitchen table and lit a small oil lamp that stood beside the window. The soft yellow light spread across the room, creating gentle shadows that danced along the walls. The farmer never minded the quiet evenings. In fact, he had always believed that silence was one of life's greatest comforts because it allowed the mind to rest after a day of honest work. He filled a small kettle with fresh water and placed it on the stove once more. As the water slowly heated, he opened a cupboard and selected a handful of dried chamomile flowers that he had gathered from the meadow during the summer. He poured the hot water over them and patiently waited while the gentle fragrance filled the room. Carrying the warm cup to the living room, he settled into an old wooden rocking chair beside the fireplace. Although there was no need for a fire on such a pleasant summer evening, the fireplace remained the heart of the house, reminding him of countless winters spent reading, repairing tools, or simply listening to the sound of snow falling outside. He took slow sips of the warm tea while looking through the window at the peaceful darkness beyond the glass. The moon had already risen above the trees, bathing the fields in soft silver light. The barn stood quietly in the distance, and every now and then he could hear the gentle movement of the animals preparing to sleep. Somewhere beyond the orchard an owl called into the night, and another answered from the far side of the valley. The old farmer smiled as he listened. Every sound felt familiar, like the voices of old friends who had shared his evenings for decades. After finishing his tea, he stood up and walked toward a small wooden bookshelf filled with worn volumes whose covers had faded with age. He selected a favorite book about wild birds and settled back into his chair. He had read many of its pages countless times before, yet each visit felt fresh because every season gave new meaning to the words. Occasionally he paused to glance out the window whenever he heard the flutter of wings or the rustle of leaves outside. Reading never separated him from nature. Instead, it helped him appreciate even more the world waiting beyond his doorstep. After an hour or so, he gently closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. Before preparing for bed, he walked through each room of the house, checking that every window was secure and every lamp except one had been extinguished. These simple habits had become part of his evening routine many years ago, and following them brought him a quiet sense of order. Finally, he stepped outside onto the porch one last time before ending the day. The night air felt cool and refreshing against his face. Above him stretched a sky filled with countless bright stars that seemed far clearer than those seen from busy towns and cities. He rested both hands on the porch railing and spent several peaceful minutes simply looking upward. He did not count the stars or search for constellations. He simply admired their quiet beauty and allowed himself to feel grateful for another ordinary day lived close to the land he loved. When at last he returned inside, he quietly blew out the final lamp, climbed the old wooden staircase, and slipped beneath a thick handmade quilt. Outside, the wind continued its gentle journey across the sleeping fields, while inside the little farmhouse the old farmer closed his eyes with a peaceful smile, ready to welcome whatever tomorrow's sunrise might gently bring. During the middle of the night, the farmhouse rested in complete silence while the old farmer slept peacefully beneath his warm quilt. Outside, a gentle wind moved across the fields, bending the tall grass with slow and graceful motions that could only be seen beneath the bright moonlight. The stars covered the sky like countless tiny lanterns, and the narrow stream beside the meadow reflected both the moon and the shimmering constellations. Every living creature on the farm seemed to understand that night was a time for rest. The cows lay quietly inside the barn, breathing slowly as they slept on fresh straw. The chickens perched safely on their wooden roosts with their feathers tucked close to their bodies. Even the old farm dog, curled beside the barn door, dreamed peacefully while occasionally moving one paw as though chasing something across an endless green field. The hours passed gently, untouched by noise or hurry. Long before sunrise, the old farmer slowly opened his eyes. He remained in bed for a few quiet moments, listening carefully. He could hear the distant sound of crickets beginning to fade, replaced little by the first songs of waking birds. The old clock downstairs continued its steady ticking, reminding him that another day had quietly arrived. He smiled to himself, thankful for another peaceful morning. At his age, every new sunrise felt like a precious gift rather than an ordinary event. He sat up slowly, stretched his shoulders, and folded his blanket neatly before leaving the bedroom. His movements were calm and familiar, guided by routines that had remained almost unchanged for many decades. When he reached the kitchen, he opened the back door for a moment and breathed deeply. The cool morning air carried the scent of damp earth, pine trees, and fresh grass covered with tiny drops of dew. A faint mist rested over the lower fields, giving the landscape a soft and dreamlike appearance. The eastern horizon was beginning to glow with pale shades of orange and pink, promising another clear summer day. He filled the kettle once again and prepared a simple breakfast of warm bread. Butter, fresh honey, and one of the eggs collected the previous morning. As he ate, he looked through the kitchen window toward the orchard, where the first rays of sunlight slowly reached the tops of the apple trees. A pair of robins landed near the garden fence, searching the ground for worms while a squirrel hurried along the stone wall carrying an acorn almost as large as its head. These small morning visitors always brought him quiet happiness because they reminded him that every day began with life already in motion. After washing his plate and cup, he slipped into his old boots and buttoned his faded work shirt. Before leaving the house, he picked up a small notebook from the table. Inside it, he kept simple notes about the weather, the seasons, the harvest, and the small changes he noticed on the farm. He opened it to a fresh page and carefully wrote the date along with a few observations about the cool night, the clear sky, and the healthy condition of the wheat fields. The notebook was not meant for anyone else to read. It was simply his quiet conversation with the passing years. Closing the notebook, he placed it back on the shelf and stepped outside just as the sun finally rose above the distant hills. Golden light spread across the fields once more, touching every tree, every flower, and every blade of grass with gentle warmth. The farm awakened exactly as it always had. Without hurry and without noise, welcoming another ordinary day filled with meaningful work, peaceful moments, and the simple beauty that the old farmer had treasured throughout his long and grateful life. After the morning chores were finished and the animals had been fed, the old farmer decided it was time to make his weekly trip to the nearby village. He did not need to go very often because the farm provided almost everything he required, but once every week he enjoyed visiting the small market to buy a few simple supplies and greet the people he had known for many years. He walked to the old wooden shed where his small pickup truck rested beneath a roof of weathered tiles. The vehicle was almost as old as some of the trees on the farm, its green paint faded by countless summers and winters, yet it started faithfully every time he turned the key. He loaded a small basket containing fresh eggs, a few jars of golden honey, and several ripe apples that he planned to share with his neighbors. He believed that good harvests were meant to be enjoyed together rather than kept for oneself. The narrow country road leading to the village wound gently between fields, meadows, and small forests. As he drove slowly, he lowered the window and allowed the cool breeze to enter the cab. Wildflowers bloomed along both sides of the road, their bright colors standing out against the rich green grass. Every now and then he passed another farmer driving a tractor or walking beside a flock of sheep, and they always greeted each other with a friendly wave. There was no need for long conversations because years of shared work and familiar faces had already created a quiet understanding between them. When he reached the village square, the weekly market was already busy, though never noisy. Wooden stalls displayed fresh vegetables, handmade bread, colorful flowers, local cheese, and baskets woven from willow branches. The old farmer parked beneath a large chestnut tree and carried his basket toward the market. Several shopkeepers greeted him by name with warm smiles, asking how the harvest was progressing and whether the recent rains had been enough for the crops. He answered each question patiently, speaking with the calm voice of someone who never felt the need to rush through a conversation. At one stall he exchanged a jar of honey for a fresh loaf of bread baked that very morning. At another he purchased a small bag of coffee beans, a packet of vegetable seeds for the coming season, and a spool of strong twine that would be useful around the farm. The village baker slipped an extra pastry into his paper bag, insisting that it was a gift, while the old farmer responded by leaving several apples on the counter for the baker's grandchildren. Neither of them considered it a trade. It was simply the way neighbors had treated one another for as long as anyone could remember. Before returning home, he stopped beside a small bench beneath the shade of an old plane tree in the center of the square. Sitting quietly, he watched children chasing pigeons while older villagers talked peacefully about the weather, the harvest, and the changing seasons. Nobody seemed to be in a hurry. Time moved gently in the village, much as it did on his farm. He finished a cup of freshly brewed coffee from the small cafe beside the square, thanked the owner, and began the drive back home. The afternoon sunlight shimmered across the fields as he followed the familiar road once again. When the farmhouse finally appeared beyond the trees, he felt the same quiet satisfaction he experienced every time he returned. The village was pleasant and full of friendly faces, but the farm was where his heart truly belonged. He carried his purchases into the house, placed everything neatly in its proper place, and stepped back outside. The breeze still carried the scent of hay, wildflowers, and warm earth, and the peaceful land welcomed him home as though he had never left. Another small journey had ended, and another quiet afternoon on the farm was waiting to unfold. When the old farmer returned from the village, he did not go inside immediately. Instead, he stood quietly in the middle of the yard and looked around his farm with calm and satisfied eyes. The familiar buildings, the green fields, the old barn, and the orchard seemed even more beautiful after spending a few hours away. He believed that leaving home for a short while made it easier to appreciate its quiet comforts. The afternoon sun shone warmly across the land, and a gentle breeze carried the pleasant scent of fresh hay mixed with the fragrance of blooming flowers. The swallows flew low above the fields, catching insects with effortless grace, while a pair of white clouds drifted lazily across the bright blue sky. Everything appeared peaceful, exactly as it should be. He smiled softly before walking toward the vegetable garden once again. Although he had already cared for the plants earlier that day, he liked checking on them every afternoon. He slowly walked between the neat rows of tomatoes, beans, onions, carrots, and lettuce, looking carefully at each plant. Some tomatoes had ripened enough to be picked, their deep red color glowing in the sunlight. He gently placed several of them into a woven basket, making sure not to damage the vines. Nearby, he noticed that the bean plants had climbed higher along their wooden supports, and the cucumber vines had spread farther across the rich dark soil. The garden rewarded careful attention every single day, and the old farmer never grew tired of watching small changes become lasting growth. After leaving the garden, he carried the basket of vegetables into the farmhouse and placed them neatly on the kitchen table. Some would become tomorrow's lunch, while others would be shared with neighbors later in the week. Nothing pleased him more than food that had grown only a few steps away from his own front door. He then returned outside carrying a wooden rake. During the previous day's work, a few dry leaves and scattered branches had collected near the entrance to the barn. He slowly gathered them into a neat pile and carried them to the compost heap behind the orchard, where they would eventually become rich soil for future crops. On the farm, very little was considered waste. Nature found a purpose for nearly everything, and the old farmer had learned to follow that same simple wisdom. As the afternoon slowly turned toward evening, he walked through the orchard one more time. The leaves rustled gently overhead while patches of golden sunlight filtered through the branches, creating moving patterns on the soft grass below. He paused beneath the old apple tree where he had rested earlier in the week and sat quietly on the weathered wooden bench. From there he could see nearly the entire farm. The wheat field stretched toward the distant hills, the small stream sparkled in the fading light. And the barn stood proudly beside the pasture exactly where it had stood for generations. Looking across the peaceful landscape, he felt no desire for a different life. He had never been the richest man, nor the most famous, but he had always been surrounded by honest work, fresh air, loyal animals, and the steady beauty of the natural world. Those things had always been enough. After a while, he stood up and slowly made his way toward the barn for one final inspection before sunset. He checked the doors, filled the water containers, and made sure every animal was comfortable for the coming night. The cows quietly chewed their hay, the chickens had already begun settling onto their wooden roosts. And the old farm dog followed him faithfully from one corner of the yard to another before finally lying down beside the porch steps. The sky gradually changed from bright blue to soft orange and gentle purple as the sun approached the horizon. The old farmer removed his hat for a moment and allowed the cool evening breeze to pass through his white hair. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise, another peaceful morning, and another collection of simple tasks waiting to be completed with care. That thought filled him with quiet happiness. There was comfort in knowing that life would continue at its own gentle pace, just as it always had on the little farm he had loved for so many years. The sun slowly disappeared behind the distant hills, leaving the sky painted with gentle shades of orange, pink, and deep violet. The old farmer stood quietly beside the porch for a few moments, watching the last light of the day fade across the fields. A calm breeze carried the familiar sense of fresh grass, wildflowers, and rich soil, while the evening chorus of crickets and frogs began once again. The farm was settling down for the night, just as it had done every evening for as long as he could remember. He took one final walk around the yard, not because there was more work to do, but because he simply enjoyed seeing everything before darkness arrived. The barn doors were safely closed. The animals were comfortable, the vegetable garden rested beneath the cooling air, and the orchard stood peacefully beneath the first bright stars. Every corner of the farm seemed to breathe with quiet contentment. The old farmer smiled, knowing that another ordinary day had come to a gentle and satisfying end. He stepped onto the porch and sat in his old rocking chair, listening to the peaceful sounds surrounding his home. There was no excitement, no rush, and no great adventure waiting beyond the horizon, yet he never considered his life dull. He had learned long ago that happiness did not always arrive through extraordinary moments. More often, it appeared in simple routines, honest work. Warm sunshine, fresh rain, the laughter of birds, and the quiet satisfaction of caring for something that slowly grew because of patience and love. He thought about the changing seasons that had shaped his life. Spring always arrived with new hope as tiny green shoots pushed through the soil after the long winter. Summer filled the fields with color, warmth, and busy days beneath bright skies. Autumn rewarded months of careful work with baskets full of fruit, vegetables, and golden grain ready for harvest. Winter covered everything with peaceful snow, inviting slower days beside the fireplace while the land rested beneath its white blanket. Every season had taught him something valuable. And together they had become the rhythm of his life. He understood that people, just like the fields, experienced seasons of growth, seasons of hard work, seasons of reward, and seasons of rest. None of them lasted forever, and that was exactly what made each one precious. Looking across the quiet farm, he realized that the greatest gift the land had ever given him was not the harvest itself but the lessons hidden inside every ordinary day. It had taught him patience because crops could never be hurried. It had taught him gratitude because every sunrise offered another chance to begin again. It had taught him kindness because animals responded best to gentle hands and calm voices. Most of all, it had taught him that a meaningful life was built little by little, through thousands of small actions repeated with care over many years. As darkness fully embraced the countryside, the old farmer slowly stood up and took one last look at the field stretching beneath the moonlight. Tomorrow the birds would sing again before sunrise. Dew would once more cover the grass. The kettle would whistle in the quiet kitchen. The animals would wait for their breakfast, and the garden would welcome his steady footsteps between its rows. Another peaceful day would begin, different in its small details yet beautifully familiar in its gentle rhythm. With a grateful heart, he quietly returned inside, closed the front door, and extinguished the final lamp. Outside, the stars continued shining over the sleeping farm, while inside, the old farmer rested peacefully, knowing that the simple life he had chosen had given him everything he had ever truly needed. And so the quiet story of the old farmer did not really end that evening, because with every sunrise the land offered him another page, another season, and another beautiful ordinary day to live.